Okay, everyone, hello. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks for eating the pizza. Thank you for coming to this very important event. This is Racism and Climate Change, putting racial justice at the center of systemic transformation. I am Pete Davis, a 3L here at the law school and the chair of the Harvard Law Forum, the longest running American law school speaker series. This year we are celebrating the 70th anniversary of the forum. Yes, 70 years ago, Harry Truman was president. Hillary Clinton and Mitt Romney were born, UFOs were spotted for the first time at Roswell, and a little institution was started here on Mass Ave to bring speakers to campus to talk about the important issues of today. 70 years later, the forum is focused on our law school's mission statement, which is to educate leaders who contribute to the advancement of justice and the well-being of society. We want speakers who inspire us to go beyond monetizing our law degrees in service of the wealthy and powerful and toward deploying them to address the important legal crises of today. And today we have an amazing speaker at the intersection of two of the most important crises, and specifically legal crises of today, racial injustice and climate injustice. And before I introduce her, a few important orders of business. First, we would like to thank our co-sponsors. Who is here from the Environmental Law Society? Any Environmental Law Society folks? Wonderful. Who is here from the Environmental Law Review? Environmental Law Review. National Lawyers Guild? Students for Inclusion, Black Law Students Association. Thank you all for co-sponsoring and thank you for coming out. Second, a plug regarding our mission statement, shameless plug. If you are interested in ways Harvard Law can better serve the public, how we can be an institution that responds to what Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. called the felt necessities of our time, the Harvard Law Record has issued a report, Our Bicentennial Crisis, a call to action for Harvard Law School's mission statement. We have copies here if you want to pick them up. Now on to the topics of the day. Our speaker will be the one to best introduce us to the intersection of racism and climate change, but I wanted to take one last minute to share one example of why this topic is specifically important to lawyers. Two Harvard academics in August 2017 published a paper entitled Assessing Exxonmobil's Climate Change Communications 1977 to 2014. The paper looked into 187 instances of climate change-related communication by the company, scientific publications, internal company documents, and advertisements in newspapers. What they found was that in Exxon's private communications, Exxon scientists were advancing the scientific consensus that climate change is real and human-caused. But at the same time, in public communications, Exxon was spreading doubt about the very scientific consensus they were contributing to. Their conclusion, Exxon had misled the public, quote, Exxon contributed quietly to the science and loudly to raising doubts about it. Now, when state attorneys general are looking into finding out more information for charging them with misleading the public and their shareholders, who is Exxon turning to? Paul Weiss and Haynes and Boone. They're going to the mat to stop subpoenas for documents from 1997 to 2007. In 2016, Paul Weiss lawyers sent a letter to the Union of Concerned Scientists warning the group against destroying or deleting communications related to their probes, meaning they're going to help counter-investigate environmental groups that are trying to tell the truth about Exxon and protect future generations. When a group of Alaska natives sought compensation for Chevron for the relocation of their village due to flooding and erosion caused by climate change, King and Spalding successfully defended against them. When the Obama administration's EPA tried to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, Hunton and Williams, longtime coal law firm, fought them tooth and nail. In 2012, Jones Day bragged about how they were able to win a motion to dismiss for a global climate change class action against Xcel Energy related to property damage of poor communities of color caused by Hurricane Katrina. The Sierra Club said that the following about Jeffrey Bozert Clark, who was recently picked by the Trump administration to head DOJ's Environmental and Natural Resources Division. Clark is a prominent denier of climate change, frequently critiquing greenhouse gas regulations and the Clean Power Plan. He was a key figure in industry's challenges to EPA's endangerment finding that set the scientific basis for all subsequent attempts to regulate greenhouse gases. Where did Jeffrey Clark do this wonderful work? Kirkland and Ellis. Fortunately, there are amazing people fighting these corporate interest law firms to help protect ourselves, vulnerable communities, and future generations, and we have one here today. Jacqueline Patterson is the director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. Since 2007, she has served as the coordinator and co-founder of Women of Color United. Jacqui Patterson has worked as a researcher, program manager, coordinator, advocate, and activist, a woman who wears many hats, working on women's rights, violence against women, HIV and AIDS, racial justice, economic justice, and environmental and climate justice. And I'd like to mention she also served as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in Jamaica. Let's give a big Harvard Law Forum welcome to Jacqueline Patterson. Thank you.
When we talk about racism and climate change, we talk about it from the continuum, from the drivers of climate change to the impacts of climate change, and how racism is a undergirding current to how all of the systems that are driving climate change and the lack of response to climate change are disproportionately impacting communities of color in particular. And so I put this list of comments up here because a lot of, so these are just some of the comments that we all should have a right to. And in the context of talking about climate change and the drivers of climate change, part of the challenge is how we get these, who has access to the commons, and then how we get certain aspects of this commons are what are some of the key drivers of climate change, such as how we produce energy, how we deal with waste, and so forth and so on, how we get water, and then who has access to these different aspects. So I wanted to kind of put this up here to remind us to what we should all have a right to as kind of the basics of what we need to get from day to day. And so this will be a recurring theme throughout. So the current course that we're on in terms of the reckless extraction and so forth is that we're looking at this commoditization of natural resources, and therefore the way that we commoditize natural resources is one of the key places of how we've gotten to where we are in terms of climate change. And I wanted to also ground this in this quote from Martin Luther King: "I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few." So then that again refers back to this notion of the commons and how we are having certain groups that are deprived of the commons while other people are living kind of hand over fist in terms of luxuries. And then when we talk about the historical context in terms of rampant extraction and exploitation of humans as well as natural resources, and then also going further to actually institutionalize how rampant extraction, exploitation, and domination happens. They get institutionalized in our policies, our trade policies, our manufacturing policies, and so forth. And so then the folks who are in power, who make the rules and maintain the status quo, are not representative of communities of color across the country for the most part. And so when we talk about the ways that we see this kind of exploitation and extraction and domination happen, there are certain aspects that are used to oppress certain categories of our society, while others are doing quite well in society. So economic status, political power, educational status, gender, race, immigration status are all kind of points of exploitation and domination. So where we have kind of winners and losers in those categories all too often. And I want to also remind us of what our human rights are, just kind of tying back to the comments about what we should all have a right to as humans. We don't in the United States talk as much about human rights as we talk about civil rights, but we should all have access to these basic human rights as well as civil rights. Another quote from Martin Luther King: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Because even as we talk about racism, then we often think that only the people who are in racialized categories, are the ones who are impacted by racism. But really, all of society loses when racism is such a pattern in our society. So in terms of the commons and sacrifice, so to who pays the cost for the access of the luxuries to the few, I want to just kind of take us through some of our systems as we talk about the systemic transformation that we need. So this is the oil refinery that is one of 5 oil refineries within a 10-mile radius of this school. It's located in Houston, Texas at the Cesar Chavez High School. And it is Houston is a place where we find out even more so in the context of poverty, but what they've known all along is that there's no zoning in Houston because they consider themselves to be a pro-business city. So they really are all about setting themselves up so they can attract as many businesses as possible with no holds barred in terms of how they operate and where they operate. And it's communities of color that pay the price for that. So where these oil refineries are located are disproportionately in low-income communities, but particularly Latino communities and African-American communities. And these kids who are in this school are one of the many sets of kids who are paying the price for energy production through oil. And then we all know about the BP oil drilling disaster. This is one of the lawn signs that people put out when they felt powerless. They actually used lawn signs to communicate their sense of frustration and anger over what was happening to their communities. And this is one sign that they actually painted on the BP gas station after it closed one night to really, again, they felt like they were in this David and Goliath situation, so this is how they express themselves. And then we know the coal industry from cradle to grave. 76,000 coal miners have died of black lung disease since 1968, while year after year, the National Mining Association, which is comprised of those very companies that employ the workers, have fought against the regulations that would have protected them from coal mine dust, which is, of course, the known driver of black lung disease. And so we start to see the connection between money and politics and corporate control over our political system, really at the expense of the lives of the 76,000 coal miners and counting. And then we have on the other side the coal combustion. 68% of African Americans have historically lived within 30 miles of coal-fired power plants. So that means that sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, mercury, arsenic, lead is going into the air, the water, the soil of these communities to negative impacts. When we talk about the other side of coal combustion is residuals, or what they call coal ash, another largely unregulated. And we actually are having rollbacks with the few regulations that there are around coal ash. And this is a picture of the big disaster that happened in 2008, the Kingston Valley, or the Tennessee Valley coal ash spill that happened then. And there are multiple coal ash spills happening all of the time. Recently I went and visited North Carolina after one of the coal ash spills and found that Duke had built a fishing pier on a coal ash pond. And so the stuff that goes into coal ash ponds include selenium, lead, all these other toxins. And so when you're on the other side of burning coal, then the residuals are even more toxic than any other part of the production process of coal-based energy. And so that's what's going into these waterways and what people are fishing for their food out of. And we put out just again looking at this whole thing about who's negatively impacted by being host to the toxic facilities and then who doesn't have access. We put out this report earlier this year called Lights Out in the Cold, Reforming Utility Shutoff Policies as a Human Rights Matter. In that report and beyond, we find that it is, of course, low-income folks and communities of color that are more likely to have their electricity shut off, so more likely to host electricity production processes that are harmful to their health, and also more likely to not have access to those very resources that are generated there. And then the ultimate in terms of most impacted but least benefiting is these figures, which is, can anyone guess what these figures are? At least in the energy sector? Okay, so $6 trillion is kind of the annual the revenue generated by the energy sector. $41 billion is the amount that African Americans on average spend yearly on energy. 1.1% is the number of jobs in the energy sector held by African Americans, and less than 0.1% is the amount of revenue from the energy sector that comes in the African American communities. And so this kind of, again, we're talking about the most harm in terms of health impacts, the less likely to even access electricity, and then less likely to even gain from the economics while being host to these facilities. And so this again really points out the the disparities and the apartheid kind of situation that we have within the energy sector for folks who are more likely to be hosting of the energy production processes. And this is just to add to that, is these are just economic figures in terms of black-white wealth ratio, 13-1, and that African Americans make 59.2 cents compared to the dollar that a white American makes. And again, that also shows that even with the income differential not being as great, but the wealth differential being 13 times kind of also tells another story, which is a whole presentation in and of itself, but it just again kind of shows that apartheid piece. So our waste systems, this is from Color of Change, and they put out this to show where the waste from the BP oil drilling disaster went. POC stands for People of Color, and so as you see in the barrel, you see the size of the barrel and the amount corresponds to how much went to these communities, and so. For all of the communities really that received the waste, the percentage of people of color is higher than the average number of people of color in those states. And so we saw where largely the most amount of waste went to the communities that had the higher proportions of people of color. The second highest number of proportion of people of color received the largest amount of waste. In the distribution, and what this says is not that BP decided they just wanted to pollute on people of color, but it more so says that landfills are disproportionately sited in communities of color. So this is another piece where something that is necessary for everyday existence, the disposal of waste happens disproportionately in communities of color, particularly African American communities. There's a landmark report called Toxic Waste and Race that started to tell the story, and every time it's updated, the story persists. And so, also incinerators are the same thing, disproportionately located in communities of color. And even in our food production, folks may have heard of CAFOs, commercial animal feeding operations, and these are some of the places where what it looks like in terms of some of these large-scale operations, and those particularly in the South are disproportionately located in communities of color, and they've been tied to health concerns in those very communities. Our water systems, we all know about the Flint water crisis, which really started with the fact that the river was so toxically polluted in the first place because of the lack of regulations around pollution of our waterways, and then moved to as industry, the same industry that polluted the river was uprooted from the community because it was more economic for them to operate elsewhere, overseas or otherwise, and so we had this disinvestment from those communities. That means that they lost 85,000 jobs where there was only a population of 200,000 in the community in the first place. And then that put the community in such blight that it allowed for this displaced democracy where they imposed the emergency financial manager law, which means that the person who was put in place to make the decisions for the community was only making, for Flint, Michigan, was only making decisions based on what the economic impact of the decisions would be, with no concern around human rights and civil rights in that context. And while the mayor and the city council were put to the side, and that's where we see the result of the water supply being switched and the contamination of the river. And at the same time as we see contamination of the waterways, we also see where people are being shut off of their water in Detroit and Baltimore and all these different places, again, for non-payment. But again, this being an essential human right, we should have a system where people are afforded, especially in this land of such riches, where people are able to access something that's vital, essential for life. Transportation and goods movement, again, communities of color are more likely to be exposed to near roadway air pollution, and when you have exposed to near roadway air pollution, you're more likely to suffer the health effects of that, including shipping channels, where in places like Delaware, Houston, Louisiana, and so forth, where these petrochemical corridors, where they have these large shipping operations, people have the health impacts of that. And so when we look at the various ways that all of these processes impact health and well-being, it's coming into our bodies through air pollution, water pollution, soil contamination, and again, it's the communities of color who have these highly toxic conditions that result in these types of impacts. This is one such family in Dixon, Tennessee, where they had their landfill that was next to their home. A set of homes was contaminated when the landfill liner eroded, and the landfill ended up, the stuff from the landfill ended up getting into the water supply, including trichloroethylene, which was a known carcinogen. They found that out when this woman, Sheila Hope Orsted, went home when her father was dying of cancer, and she found that everyone in her home, the homestead, where a number of homes were in the same area, had some rare form of cancer, and a number of people had also rare forms of children's birth defects. And so she ended up looking into it and found out that some years before they had sent out letters, the county, saying that the landfill had been compromised and that the water supply had been contaminated, but the folks in those homes didn't get the letters, and now it happened to be all the African American homes, but the white homes, white families on the other side had gotten these letters, and so they had been drinking trichloroethylene contaminated water for years without being notified, and even the animal shelter that was next door had been put on an alternate form of water for all of those years while they drank the water. And so this was a classic case of environmental racism, and so they actually ended up getting a multi-million-dollar settlement from it because they were definitely found to be culpable in that circumstance. And unfortunately, they're not alone. Similarly, in terms of contamination and lack of access, this family is a Navajo family in the Four Corners region out in New Mexico, Arizona area. That coal-fired power plant behind them is one of 4 coal-fired power plants within a 50-mile radius of where they live. They are holding a picture of someone who died of a respiratory disease. They talk about the other people in their family who have respiratory illnesses. And there's no men in the family in the picture because the men in the family are actually having to work in neighboring states, because even though the Navajo leaders welcomed these coal plants into the community, they welcomed them because they came with the promise of jobs, but they didn't bring as many jobs as they promised, and the people in the jobs ended up bringing people in the jobs as well, so it didn't really go to the people who live in the community. So this is yet another situation where they're getting all the negative health impacts, but not actually even getting the jobs from the situation. And also in terms of the separation between the resource being generated, those 2 coolers are on their porch because they, like 70% of the people on these Navajo lands, or what the government calls reservations, do not have access to electricity. And so 70% of the people who are living within the shadows and choking down the fumes from these coal-fired power plants don't even have the resources being generated from them, because the electricity being generated is being transmitted to Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and Phoenix to power those communities, not the communities that are host to these facilities. And so we also talk about the intersection with other social justice challenges for communities. These are the medicines of one young boy who lives 2 miles away from a coal-fired power plant in Florida called Indiantown. And his parents sent me this picture to show what he needs in order to be able to get from day to day. And then they also sent this picture of him looking on as another child is playing in the water fountain, because they felt like this is emblematic of his life. He's watching other kids play, or he's watching other kids go to school, but he can't go to school like other kids on poor air quality days because of the severity of his asthma. And when we talk about kids not being able to go to school on poor air quality days, or kids who are in school but having a hard time paying attention because lead is another thing that comes out of these smokestacks, they might also be drinking lead in their water from antiquated infrastructure, or even experiencing still lead paint in their homes. All the ways that these kids are experiencing environmental injustices that they compromise their ability to learn. And then on top of that, if you're living next to a toxic facility, which 71% of African Americans live in counties in violation of air pollution standards, and are more likely to live next to toxic facilities, then your property values are on average 15% lower. And we know the property values is what finances our school system. So we have all of that stacked up against kids being able to have educational attainment on grade level. And studies show that if you're not on grade level by the 3rd grade, you're more likely to enter into the school or prison pipeline. So this is how we see all of these issues intersectional in terms of the way racism plays a role in all of these aspects, and then to the detriment of the ability of folks to be able to progress and excel. And then when we also talk about the ways that these various issues are dealt with in environmental contamination, these 4 images are kind of 4 different crises where community, their water supply and so forth was contaminated. And what 3 of them have in common is that it was largely African American, and then 1 was largely white American. And the difference, 3 of them have been going on for years in terms of the Flint water crisis. The 8 Mile area of Alabama and Mobile have lived with 8+ years of this after this oil gas spill that got into their water supply and so forth. And then in East Chicago, Indiana, where they've been decades dealing with lead and arsenic contaminated soil that's gotten into the systems of these kids. But then last year with the Porter Ranch gas leak, literally, within days it was capped, and then now they're already talking about a $4 million settlement. And it's such a radical difference when we're talking about a wealthy white community versus the other 3 African American communities that are lower income. And so a lot of times people want to make the link between, I guess, poor Black communities, but it's not just poor Black communities, it's Black communities across the board. An African American family making $50,000 a year is more likely to live next to a toxic facility than a white American family making $15,000 a year. And that's according to Dr. Robert Bullitt, who is a giant in the environmental justice field at Texas Southern University. So hopefully this will go smoothly for us. A little bit of a kind of out of the mouths of babes in terms of their understanding of the connection between environmental injustice and climate change and even our political system.
We need to take control. We need to take control. We need to take control of this climate. We need to take control. We need to take control. We need to take control of this climate. We need to take control. We need to take control. We need to take control of this climate.
It's getting hot, yeah, it's heating up. The climate changing, how it's affecting us. You mean the flood, storms, droughts, and fires, and heat-related deaths in the U.S. is getting higher, huh? Now whoever you ain't rich on what you doing. Neighborhoods affected by all this air pollution, and it's amusing, it's a problem, it's a solution. Decrease your carbon footprint, it's really not hard to do. I went going green since a little kid. In my hood, the heat is killing kids. I speak for the climate, yeah, I'm the earth's ventriloquist. Those heat waves, know you feeling it. Stop burning that coal, use propane when you grilling it, cause it can harm your respiratory. Ask these politicians for change, they ain't doing nothing for me. They pollute around my area, cause we ain't in the category. We need to take control of this climate, led into prosperity.
I'm ready to climb.
This country's morals laws, somebody help me find it. Our eco-death certificate, they ready to sign it. And I ain't having that, especially not around my habitat. And that's mainly where it happened at. They acting up on us, so that's the reason why we acting back. Protesting, lobbying, going green is my hobby, man. Stop drilling for fossils, worry about tomorrow. Keep going at this rate, the whole earth will be in sorrow. No resources to borrow. I said let's take control of our climate and your carbon footprint. Please try to decline it.
So yeah, you get the idea. So I was impressed by their observations of kind of how it all fits together. And so as we talk about these same polluting facilities that impact our health and well-being, that are the same facilities and practices that are also contributing to our greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change. And so these very same communities that are more likely to be host to these various facilities and so forth are also less likely to be able to access energy, less likely to be able to access water, and also less likely to be able to access healthy and nutritious foods, even while the production of food happens in their communities to a negative detriment for those communities. And so you have communities where they're more likely to get their food from a corner store, which has foods that are high in sodium, high in preservatives, high in sugars, and not only foods that aren't good for you, but that are actively bad for you. And as we see the shifts in agricultural yields resulting from climate change, this is only going to get worse. And we all know about the extreme weather events. We just had one and continuing to have one. And it's, again, communities of color, low-income communities that are often most impacted because of the lack of cushion in different ways. And we'll talk about a couple of those examples. And then when we talk about the intersection between these communities being more likely to host these toxic facilities and disasters, you have a situation like Port Gibson, Mississippi, which is host to a nuclear reactor. It's a largely African-American poor community where the mobility is low. And when the nuclear reactor was being proposed for the community, they fought hard against it because they were afraid about there's only one road in and out of the community, and they also were afraid about what it means to be next to a nuclear reactor in terms of emissions and pollution and so forth. And when this disaster came through, sure enough, the alarms were going off, and they were saying that the reactor was in threat of being breached. And it came to light that even the Red Cross couldn't set up full operations there because they don't set up operations within 7 miles of a nuclear reactor. So again, that's nothing against the Red Cross. That means that if they're not even able to set up, they're not willing to put their employees in harm's way, that means that people shouldn't be living there either within 7 miles away. That's their measure. So these are the kind of challenges that we see as we look at this at these intersections. And so in the aftermath of Katrina, a lot of the analysis showed that the folks who were more likely to perish in this disaster, people who had low mobility, people with special health concerns, and so forth. And by and large, it was largely African Americans who were more likely to perish in that disaster. One little known issue is the impact that it had on the prison population, because the deputies, all the officials literally just left. They evacuated and left the people just locked up. They didn't have a plan for disaster situations, and so they just literally just ran for their lives and left people in, with no ventilation, no food, no water. The sewage table waters are rising. They had to dig through the walls just to get ventilation, and no one should be treated. I mean, it was as if they didn't matter as humans, and no matter what people did or didn't do, no one should be treated that way. And so then we also know that in the Caribbean, we have to add now Puerto Rico and Barbuda, which is a country of African descent, largely in the Caribbean there, and where now for the first time in over 300 years, no one lives there. Like the country is uninhabitable, the entire nation. And we all know what's happening in Puerto Rico now. And these are, whether it's communities of color that are more impacted or countries of color that are more impacted, we know that if the whole state of Montana, 75% of people didn't have electricity, we know that the response would be much different than what we're seeing happening in Puerto Rico, one of our states as well, one of our territories as well. So again, we see this kind of current of racism running consistently. And with this extreme weather events, and then we also have sea level rise as one of the impacts of climate change. So we have a place like the Maldives, which has built a seawall around the nation now. And some of the areas in the U.S. are also thinking about doing the same. In 2009, the Maldives actually had a cabinet meeting underwater to illustrate internally into the world that that's where they're going to be. At that point, 20 years, but now in less than 15 years. And so they are now talking with Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, to talk about where they're going to relocate their entire populace. And here in the U.S., Kivalina and Thibodaux are looking at that same calculation, Thibodaux, Louisiana, within 15 years having to move their entire communities. And already we had in Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana, the Biloxi, Chittimacha, Choctaw tribe just had to move as a result of sea level rise. This is a quote from NOAA: "Today's flood is equal to tomorrow's high tide," because that's just how normal flooding is becoming, as normal as high tides. We're seeing places that have 500-year floods now on the regular every other year because of this sea level rise. And so even as we talk about when the sea level rise and so forth, there's also inequities in response. So on one hand, prisoners are abandoned after disasters, but then during the recovery time, it's prison labor that's used in cleanup and so forth. But yet they don't even get the proper training or the proper protection like other communities get to be able to do that work. And then this was a picture I took in Alabama where after one of the I guess it was a set of tornadoes that went through, it really struck me that all the people who were giving out the food in this place in Huntsville, all the people who were giving out the food were white American, and literally every last person who needed the food was African American. So it just really told the story of who was able to bounce back, who wasn't harmed, who wasn't impacted in the first place. And in that very image and in that circumstance. And then similarly, I went outside and was struck by the fact that on the stage, the people from the Red Cross, from local government, from FEMA were all white American and largely male also. And then the people who were in line to get information, who needed resources, were African American and women, which also struck me as well in terms of the people who were inside getting the food were the men, while the women were out there getting the information. But of course, a whole other presentation altogether. But and then in terms of how these, like when we talk about who was most impacted and who was able to bounce back, this one story really tells a story of like who tends to be most protected, and therefore they're less likely to be harmed. After in Plaquemines Parish in Louisiana, after the Hurricane Isaac, which came 7 years after Hurricane Katrina, it was in 2012, it totally wiped out Plaquemines Parish, which is largely fisher folks and oystermen, African American, low-income white American, and so they were asked like why. So Senator Mary Landrieu was on the news on CNN, and they asked her why it is that the levees weren't fortified in Plaquemines Parish, because that should have protected them if the levees were fortified, because other places were protected because the levees were fortified. And she says she asked the Army Corps of Engineers the same question, why they didn't have the levee fortification. And the Army Corps of Engineers said they use a formula to decide which levees to prioritize in their fortification efforts. And the formula points to each levee based on what the economic impact would be if the levee was overtaken. So again, that is another measure of property values over people. So if it was just a few kind of high value condos versus 5,000 shacks, which is the only place that people have, and that are much more vulnerable to the impacts of disasters, it's going to be those high-rise, high-value condos that are going to be protected over the 5,000 shacks. And so we see how, we just start to see how the discrimination is baked into our very policies and practices that are implemented. And so who made that formula? Who allowed that? Who signed off and said that we approved this formula and allowed that to be implemented? Those are the kind of questions that we need to ask as we seek reform that actually looks at human rights as a central value in our policy making. So as we look at intersections, these images are on the same day and the same Associated Press, where they tell two of the same stories in a very different way. So when it's white people, it's like two residents wade through chest-deep waters after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina. And when it's an African-American young man, a young man wades through chest-deep floodwaters after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. And so that really just says it all. And so the way that we tell that story then also ties to how people are then treated in any circumstance. And so we start to see how this ties to racial profiling and then police brutality to fatal results. And it was all too many folks, as we've seen in the headlines and as we've seen with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so whether it's in the United States or in the sub-Saharan Africa, we're seeing also impacts on women. So for women, it's double jeopardy. Women are disproportionately impacted by climate change as well as people of color. So women of color experiencing this double jeopardy. So whether it's people in the sub-Saharan Africa having to walk further to get water because that's the role of women in many cultures, or whether it's the fact that women are more likely to experience sexual violence and domestic violence in the aftermath of disaster, there's multiple ways that women are more impacted by climate change and its results. So these are actually just three women at the UN climate talks. The woman in the middle is from Gulfport, Mississippi. She had to evacuate after Hurricane Katrina, and the women flanking her are from the Philippines, and they had to evacuate after Super Typhoon Haiyan. So they were really united in that common experience. And so when we talk about climate immigration in this kind of punitive way that we often talk about it, we feel like we need to reframe that and talk about the fact that the U.S. is only 4% of the global population, but 25% of the emissions that drive climate change. So a lot of the migration that happens maybe because of disaster or because of resource wars that are happening as a result of our actions. And so when people are wanting to come to the country, just as often for survival or just to have livelihoods to be able to feed their families. And this, and so when we see the immigration rights battles, we see that as very much tied to these other challenges, and we see these inextricably tied. This is a quote from Kenyan-born Somali poet Warsan Shire. You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. So it tells that story. So just along the lines of racism, because we're kind of running out of time with our, so I want to just kind of maybe even, we're going to go into some of the systemic transformation. That's going to go very quickly. But with this this picture I wanted to show, because this is a household that had been, it used to be a house on this property, but the family was there when these tornadoes were coming through. They had seen this church was providing shelter for families that were coming in. It was a white church that was providing shelter, and this was the home of an African American family. So it was a woman that was there with her son, a cousin, and a neighbor, all of whom were African American. So they went to that church when they knew the tornado was coming to ask them if they said, "Oh, we see we're sheltering people there. Can we come into your shelter?" And they said, "Oh, we're not sheltering people." And so they turned them away. And they went back to the home, and the home was completely destroyed by the tornado, and only the son survived to tell the story. And so it really kind of says that we can talk about laws and so forth, and talk about the ways that the ways that racism is implemented, but we also need to think about social cohesion and how we're living together as people as well. So as we even try to make solutions, we see false solutions, whether it's market-based mechanisms, this notion of population control, when it's often the populations of people of color and people in the global south that they want to control. This notion of this false notion of clean coal and using African American families as the imagery of clean coal, which is also a false solution as well. Moving towards fracking for quote-unquote natural gas, which is tied to everything from earthquakes to water contamination. We have now water that has these high explosivity rates, which is struck me. They said this one township had explosivity rates 20 times the allowable limit, and I'm like, wow, there's an allowable explosivity rate for our water, but that was. And then we also have the fact that our earthquake fault zones, even as we have this increase in seismic activity, where in Oklahoma they used to average 35 earthquakes per year. Now they on above 3.5 on the Richter scale. Now they have 350 earthquakes per year above 3.5 on the Richter scale. And we're seeing more and more seismic activities in other places, and a number of these places are built where the earthquake fault zones have nuclear reactors built on them. And so the ones with the black triangles are ones that are built on the same model as the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear reactor. But any nuclear reactor that's impacted by an earthquake is definitely a bad situation. So why is this all happening unchecked? So we know that there are certain forces that are driving us in this direction, and it's a well-financed push in the direction that we need to shouldn't be going in. And as Pete was saying before, we even have the financing of climate denial, even though it's very much staring us in the face. And we have the people who are making decisions again, going back to this race issue, we have this kind of a separation of people who are making decisions and people who are most impacted by the decisions that are being made. And so we have a non-representational government for a whole swath of our society, and we see how that plays out in everything from the rollback of regulations to the rollback of protections to the rollback of resources that are critical for these communities, including the low-income heating and energy assistance program that would have affected some of the issues I talked to you about before. Another quote from Martin Luther King: "Law and order exists for the purpose of establishing justice, and when they fail in this purpose, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress." And so we see where our democracy is being crushed by these various actions. We even have where Halliburton actually applied for an exemption from the Safe Drinking Water Act for their fracking. Like the notion that there's even a process where you can apply for an exemption from the Safe Drinking Water Act lets us know that we're not in a good place. So anyway, there's another thing I would have shown you, but evidently we only have 6 minutes left. So we haven't even started to really talk about transformation. So, and nor have we had any Q&A. But this is a video that actually kind of talks about how we should be thinking about not naming our storms after just regular names, but we should be thinking about a different process of doing that. So, but I'm not gonna, you should watch it. It's a very, very strong video. So as we talk about the transformation that we need to make, these are the types of systems that we've talked about, and hopefully I've made a good enough case for the fact that we need complete transformation. We need to get money out of politics. We need to stop drilling and burning in order to create energy. We need to do our food locally and in a way that doesn't, that isn't inhumane for the people who are hosting those facilities and to the animals that are being handled there. We need to do our waste in a different way in terms of not burying it or burning it. We need to look towards recovery and recycling. And basically we need to kind of change everything in order to get to where we need to be in systemic transformation. This is a framework for just transition that really moves us away from exploitation and extraction into cooperation, into regeneration, and into deep democracy. And hopefully you'll have access to this afterwards, but this is just kind of talking about the various transitions that we need. And I would have given you more in terms of the stories of the types of transformations that are happening, but this just kind of gives you some images of what we're talking about. So, speaking up, talking out, that would have been another video I would have shown you, that we're linking with folks in South Africa who are giving the same messages, including the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. We're really trying to speak to the people cutting off some of these practices at their root in terms of the financing. Even taking this internationally, we were at the Paris Climate Agreement, so we did a Black Lives Matter action there, making that linkage as well. The faith community being involved with the Occupy American Petroleum Institute, the Franciscans talking out against fracking, talking about reclaiming our grid. This was a story of one community that did that. Another translocal organizing around shifting our energy systems. Ways that people are making sure to get solar for people who are low income, building local food systems together and enjoying the fruits of our labor. This was a great video. I would have loved to show you where these youth are talking about growing food and moving away from the way we produce food now. And even looking at how we improve our educational systems, having green schools, having more representation of people of color in these various institutions and government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and foundations. Again, transitioning from burning and burying waste to recycling, moving from our our transportation system in a way that's more equitable and accessible, moving into more affordable housing, and making sure that we have clean water for all. This is the town hall meeting in Flint, another great quote from Martin Luther King on that. And then economic equality for all so that we can all, be part of having livelihoods. We need to support our communities. And then finally, I will end with this kind of need to tell our own story, because so often stories are being told about communities who are in this kind of victimology notion, and we want to make sure that we are telling our own stories, and any who moves away from those narratives like we see with the looting and so forth. And so, there's a quote, African quote, until the lions write their own history, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And I was watching Saturday Night Live, and they did one of the weekend updates, and in that they talked about this, that a hunter had killed the deer, and then the deer rose up, and he thought he was dead, he was standing over him, and the deer rose up and gored the hunter, and then they said, or as told in the deer community, serial killer injured as victim fights back. So I will pretty much end on that note. These are just some kind of principles of organizing that we would want to think about as we do democratic organizing. And ending with my contact information if anybody has any questions.
Jacqui Patterson.